Ladies and gentlemen, joining us tonight is R.J. Harris, former Libertarian Party presidential candidate, currently running to represent Oklahoma's 4th Congressional District against incumbent Republican Tom Cole, who he ran against in 2010 when I was running for Congress and was endorsed by Rand Paul when Rand was running for U.S. Senate in Kentucky. He's now joining us to tell us what it was like to run a presidential campaign and why you got involved in politics in the first place. Why don't you start with that, RJ? Tell us about your military experience and how that's influenced your engagement in politics now.
Well, I've been in the military for 20 plus years now. I am currently a serving Army National Guard officer with 4 deployments. And you're kind of correct to put that question in the context of my military service and what got me involved politically, and that's because I've seen over the years more and more that our government has been going way far afield of the Constitution, and our foreign policy becomes more and more interventionist all the time. And I have been a very outspoken and vocal proponent of Ron Paul's non-interventionist foreign policy, which you know, I have to admit, it was him that brought me to this idea, this concept, and this truth about the flaw in a interventionist foreign policy. But he is absolutely correct, and I even when I was a Libertarian Party presidential candidate, which I was basically running as a backup campaign to him anyway, I went out there even running in another party and wholeheartedly endorsed Ron Paul's foreign policy message and tried to use the weight of my own credentials to point out to anyone that would listen that, you know, an interventionist foreign policy is the weaker foreign policy for many, you know, for a great many reasons. It spreads our all-volunteer military forces around the world thin to defend everybody else but ourselves, and it's askance of the Constitution, where the Constitution talks about a defense of the Republic and of its citizens and of the Constitution, as opposed to invasion, occupation, and entangling alliances around the world. Of course, we all know that our founding presidents were totally against all of that, and, you know, even just a cursory glance at history, we can see that, you know, George Washington himself argued about invading other countries without a congressional declaration of war when asked why he didn't pursue the Native American nations that had been raiding on the frontier out past the borders of the United States at that time. He said, look, I don't have a declaration of war. You know, that was the example set by the great George Washington. So you're very correct to bring up, you know, foreign policy is one of the central things.
What kind of unit are you in?
Movement. What's that?
What kind of unit are you in?
I'm in a aviation unit, air traffic control. I'm an air traffic control officer, and the unit that I'm in, we basically run an airfield.
So it's a relatively small, tight-knit unit to begin with, right?
That's correct.
So how has this been received? I mean, obviously you're an officer and you've been in long enough. You have some career security in that sense. But how have your fellow soldiers received your message? You know, obviously if you're running for president and you're in the National Guard, it's not like something you can hide that you just do casually on weekends here and there. It's something that people are going to know about. And you're saying that everything that we're doing, that your fellow troops are doing in the military, is counterproductive to national security, is against this country's best interest. I mean, that's not an easy situation to be in, is it not?
Well, sometimes it might not be, but believe it or not, the troops out there really get it, which is why so many of them have been donating to Ron Paul over the years, and more so lately than ever. And so it's really not been as hard a sell as you might think. I've had conversations with troops, not just from my own unit, but, you know, across the military spectrum, both high and low rank. And a lot of them, even though if we differ on minor points here and there, or maybe even some overarching points, I continually get positive feedback from folks that have been to my website, seen my positions articulated on foreign policy positions and issues, and they say, you know, of course, the soldiers call me chief, or you know, so do my colleagues, but, you know, they'll look at me and say, hey, RJ or chief, you know, you're right on. I might disagree with you here, there, this or little thing or that little thing, but you make a really good point for why this interventionist foreign policy is making us weaker. And, of course, I'm not the first one they've heard it from.
Right.
They've been hearing it in the Republican debates being spoken through Ron Paul's message, and they've been responding to it. So believe it or not, thanks to Ron Paul, it's been a lot easier point to make. And I might add, you know, I've been told by field grade officers, flag level officers, look, you know, I don't know if you're going to win your race or not. And of course, this is when I was still running for president, but I don't, you know, this flag officer said, you know, I don't know if you're going to win your race or not, but this stuff in Afghanistan's got to stop. It's not worth our blood and treasure anymore. Of course, he didn't use those exact words, and I'm paraphrasing to protect his identity. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter if they're low rank or high rank. And I don't pretend to speak for everyone out there. I'm sure there are folks in the military that are, you know, perfectly content with the foreign policy that we have, but there's a lot that aren't.
So, you know, I've said that R.J. Harris was really a unique candidate for the Libertarian Party, and it's really disappointing to see that your presidential campaign didn't get traction within the LP, because R.J. really is, I would say it, not being any historical expert here, that you are the most presidential candidate that the Libertarian Party has seen in a long time in terms of your background, your military service, but also your composure and your ability to carry this message in a way that has a distinct credibility. That doesn't surprise me that you have that respect from your colleagues, not just because of the issue, but because of the way you carry yourself and the way that you present the message as well. So let's shift gears for a second and talk about that, because that's a massive undertaking. You know, even running for the Libertarian Party nomination for president within, you know, a third party, you still have to run a national campaign. You have to put together a national effort. You have to, I mean, tell us what it's like. What are your objectives? What are you, other than raising funds and generating support and getting people engaged in your campaign as you would for any political campaign, what's it like putting together a campaign to win the nomination for the Libertarian Party?
Well, it was definitely a very big job of work, although something a little bit more doable than, say, going straight into the GOP primary or a Democrat primary. And it's because the Libertarian process is so much more, you know, central to its party and its constituency out there, to where, you know, a candidate like me and like the other candidates are able to just, you know, go to the statewide conventions, participate in the debates and the straw polls, which are really just beauty contests, but they give us a gauge of support out there. And then, of course, everything's going to be decided at the Libertarian Party National Convention in May. And once again, all the delegates there are completely unbound. They're allowed to vote for whoever they want to. And so you can go in there and deliver, you know, if you've been delivering solid performances out there on the campaign trail, then there would be opportunity to really compete for that nomination. And I think that the Harris campaign 2012 was doing well along that road until about early January, when Governor Johnson got in the race. And he's a very big political figure with an outstanding executive set of credentials. So he was a little bit tough to take on for a candidate like myself, who, while I have a very large following in the liberty movement out there, hadn't, you know, have to admit, haven't won an elected office yet. And so when he got into the race with that set of credentials that he has, that kind of that definitely took away from our status as the front runner at that time. But we did the best we could for as long as we could, stayed true to the message, never backed down on it, even after Governor Johnson got in the race. And I think that, you know, the debate performances that folks can see out there online through our YouTube page, or you know, all you have to do is, you know, Google search that stuff and you'll be able to find those debate performances. And I think those pretty much, I'll stand on those any day. And like I said, unfortunately we weren't able to make it to the end, but one thing that my senior staff and I and myself kind of jointly over the course of several weeks as we came down here to the wire realized that pulling off a win against Governor Johnson in the nomination was going to be a very long shot. And we had the deadline coming up April 13th to file for Oklahoma's 4th District. And as we went out there and talked to our constituents, both here in the 4th District and on the internet, it became very apparent that we had way more energetic backing for a congressional race than a presidential run with Gary in the race. And so we pulled the trigger and made the switch. And
so you're running as an independent now, but your platform, obviously, you had to be reworked. So you've done that before. You've run for Congress. That's not too difficult. I mean, hey, even I pulled that one off. But you had to put together a platform as a presidential campaign that was completely different from the perspective of the executive branch. What was that like?
Well, that was very liberating, Adam, because, when I ran for Congress in 2010, I had to, say things in the manner of, okay, well, I will fight for this, or I will vote for this and vote against that, or I'm for, repealing as much legislation as possible, and I still am to this day. But as a presidential candidate, you really get into the meat of these issues and talk about what you would do as president. And I think one of the strongest powers of the presidency is the use of negative power, which is to say, to refuse to
I will not enforce.
To refuse to enforce unconstitutional tyranny, and I don't call it unconstitutional law, because if it's unconstitutional, it's not law. So, right. So the president, even though he has constraints on what he can do, he can't legislatively. He can only really get out there and enact legislation that gets passed. So all the legislative powers given to Congress as it should be. But as president, under Article 2, is his oath of office, he can, and as supported by the writings of our founders in the Federalist Papers, we see that the president does not have to execute unconstitutional tyranny. So it was really liberating to be able to get out there and talk about what my foreign policy would be for the United States, and how I would end the drug war, and how I would use the negative powers of the presidency to prevent the continuation of more tyranny upon the American people. But I also must say, as it applies to the presidential race, and I know a lot of the folks out there understand this and know this, I got into the race primarily because I wanted to make sure the liberty movement and all of us out there that are liberty voters would have somebody to vote for in 2012 on the ballot in case Ron Paul didn't make it through the GOP primary process. And that was another very important consideration in my shift over the congressional race, because as we all know, Congressman Ron Paul is not coming back to his seat in 2012. He's putting it all behind the presidential race, and as it became more and more clear that beating Governor Johnson was a long shot for the Libertarian Party nomination, I realized that, okay, if that's the case, and with Ron not coming back to the Congress, we cannot lose his voice or his message for a single day in that body. And that was a huge part of the decision to make the switch, was to say, look, one way or another, we got to make sure that Ron Paul's message of freedom is on this ballot. Whether it's for president or whether it's Congress, doesn't matter. We got to continue to champion that message.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because this does say something about the Libertarian Party. What's recently gone down between the part when you were one of the primary contenders for the nomination, and as you said, until Gary Johnson jumped in, and R.J. Harris here was one of the first who had the courage to call out Rand Paul on the issue of Guantanamo during the 2010 election cycle. Now, I was running against an incumbent Democrat and was endorsed by Ron Paul. R.J. Harris was running against Tom Cole, an incumbent Republican, and so he was endorsed only by Rand, not by Ron. And you had still the courage to call out Rand Paul. I didn't. I got to tell you, I got to be honest, as a candidate, I didn't have the balls that R.J. Harris had to get into this issue and call out the would-be inheritor of Ron Paul's legacy, Rand Paul, and showed the movement that his policies that he was championing now as a candidate were not in line with the philosophy of liberty. And similarly, Gary Johnson, as much as I love Gary Johnson, as he was my governor of New Mexico for 2 terms, and he had demonstrated that not only did he have the integrity, he had the guts and the commitment to carry out his platform, and he vetoed more bills in 2 terms as governor of New Mexico during that time than all other governors in the country combined. And I know that says a lot about the incompetence of the New Mexico State Legislature, as well as the integrity of Gary Johnson. But it's important to note that Gary Johnson is not a philosophical libertarian, and that sets you apart and sets someone like me as well, and I think Ron Paul, apart from someone like Gary Johnson, who's just a libertarian-leaning moderate, if you will, and an absolutely honest, principled one, and someone that if it comes down to Romney Care versus Obamacare, I will be enthusiastically supporting Gary Johnson. But it's not the same as supporting someone who understands the philosophy as you do, who understands the philosophy as Ron Paul does, and communicates that and is able to connect that to the policy and move policy in a direction that's clearly guided by those principles. And you might disagree with Ron Paul on some of his immediate policy positions, but if you agree with the philosophy, you share that same commitment. And I don't know if you have anything you'd like to share about Gary Johnson in that regard, but personally, like I said, as much as I love Gary Johnson and welcome him to the contest and to run for the nomination within the Libertarian Party, I was really disappointed to see that there will not be someone in the general election unless Ron Paul gets the nomination now, or possibly Lee Wrights, who's the primary remaining contender for the Libertarian Party nomination, on that ballot in November, and that the Libertarian Party would go for Gary Johnson based on his name ID and organizational capacity and gubernatorial credibility that he brings to the party, rather than standing on principle, being the party of principle. I can't say I'm surprised that the Libertarian Party chose, or it looks like they're choosing Gary Johnson, someone like Gary Johnson, over someone like you, but I have to say I'm a bit disappointed.
Well, I just want to start off my answer by agreeing with you off the bat that when it comes down to Obamacare or Romney Care or the things that those two men represent, or Gary Johnson, the choice has got to be clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we obviously can't vote to reelect Obama, and we can't vote to elect his progressive socialist counterpart in the Republican Party. And Gary Johnson there's a clear distinction between candidates like them and Gary. But you made some good points. There are some clear differences between myself and Governor Johnson. One thing that's kind of nice about the fact that I'm running for Congress now is that, even though we have some separation on an issue just like Rand and I did on Gitmo, we can go back to being allies again, because no two candidates, no two people in the whole movement are ever going to be the same on every single issue of the day. And so I think you might see some separation between the governor and me on, for example, humanitarian war, and even he admitted this.
There are libertarians who are downright offended by Gary Johnson's foreign policy as a whole.
Right.
That he's talked about, he seems to have fallen for the Coney 2012 campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's...
Right, and I was out there talking about Coney 2012, but I was talking about it from the sense of Article 1, Section 8. This is a perfect example where a correct application of the Constitution and Article 1, Section 8 would allow people to act out on this issue that has hold their conscience internationally without committing U.S. forces and U.S. tax dollars to the cause. And that's what I had been saying. But you're right. Unfortunately, Gary has gone the other way with that. As an example of his type of support for humanitarian war.
That's an oxymoron, isn't it? Humanitarian war.
Yes, of course it is.
I mean, what is war but the systematic destruction of human bodies by machinery? How can you have a humanitarian destruction of human bodies by machinery? But and of course, I'm being a little bit facetious, but the fact remains that for those of us who believe in the philosophy of liberty, the idea of taking money from the American people to provide for security for someone else is a huge moral transgression.
Right, and the governor's going to have some trouble with the Ron Paul supporters out there, which is why I would encourage him to make some adjustments on his foreign policy, and I have offered him many times in the past, and I continue to do so to this day, assistance on these issues. Obviously, everybody recognizes that this area is one of the key legs of my platform. It's where I draw a lot of my credibility as a candidate from the foreign policy issues, and so I continue to hope that we're able to win over Governor Johnson to a much more, he is more non-interventionist than any other candidate out there except for Ron Paul and myself.
And again, Gary Johnson is set apart by his record as demonstration of his integrity. Unlike everybody else we're talking about here in the presidential race, he's not full of shit. You can trust him that to the best of his abilities, and they are significant abilities as an executive in government, having from his time in governor in New Mexico, that he will carry out, he will do what he says to the best of his ability. He's not blowing smoke to win a race.
And I have every hope, though. I mean, and I would even say confidence to say that if folks continue to correspond, not just me, but other folks out there listening to this, watching this, his supporters, his advisors, continue to work on him on these foreign policy issues. And I think that we can, I mean, he's already made some very key adjustments to his platform, and I don't pick on him for that. Whenever one of these public officials, public figures, makes a change, a transition over to the philosophy of liberty and understands it and grasps it and then takes it out there to the body politic, that's a moment for celebration on our part, because that means our message is taking root with folks that are out there that have the ability, the capability, and the gifts to deliver that message. And so, you know, we've already seen Gary make some positive adjustments on his message throughout the course of this race, and I'd like to see a little bit more from him on that, on the foreign policy side. So while there was some separation between the governor and I on some key foreign policy issues, I still think that I'm very happy that we have a candidate, a potential candidate here, or excuse me, not a potential candidate, he's clearly a candidate, but I mean, we have a candidate here in this race who understands and will pursue a foreign policy of at least less interventionism should he win the race. An idea that, to reduce taxes, reduce government, increase liberty, end the drug war. I mean, these are the kind of things, kind of the movements in the directions that we can't hope to get from just about anybody else.
All right. Well, I brought you on the show because I want to introduce you to my audience. For those of you that don't know R.J. Harris or didn't before watching this interview, he's a friend of mine, clearly someone who's committed to the message. But what the million-dollar question here for you, because we know that Ron Paul is retiring.
Right.
We know that we have Justin Amash in the U.S. House, who's truly a philosophical libertarian. We have also running for Congress out of Virginia's 6th District, Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski, who's also in a great position to bring a unique experience as a veteran to Congress and continue in Ron Paul's legacy. And I know that you would absolutely be someone who would have that same commitment and quickly establish a similar voting record to Ron Paul. But why should people outside of your district support you? And by the way, it's rjharris2012.com. But why should people who aren't in your district care about your race?
Well, because, in Congress, really, the way things have kind of shaped up in the modern era, it doesn't matter almost whether or not there's a particular congressman is from your district or not. All those folks up in Congress are voting on things that affect us all. And so even if you live in Maine or, Illinois or whatever district, whatever state of the union or territory that you live in, you folks really need to pay attention to those liberty candidates out there, especially those ones like in my race that have a real good shot at winning their seats if they got the support they needed, because then we can get more voices in Congress, just like Ron Paul's, championing that message, carrying that standard, and fighting for our freedom. And I can be fighting for the freedom of all citizens of the Republic, whether they live in Maine or whether they live in California. And I can continue to show faith and fidelity to the constituencies of the 4th District and fight for their liberty too. So, I mean, it's very important that people all over this country realize that Ron Paul is not coming back to the Congress in 2012, and that we need as many voices carrying his message and that philosophy of liberty and freedom and support for the Constitution as possible, because folks like me, candidates like me, are going to represent those that really believe in freedom and liberty and the reestablishment of our Constitution or Republic, no matter where they live. And
it doesn't hurt R.J. Harris to be running against a real neocon douchebag of a Republican in the Republican incumbent Tom Cole. Supported the bailout, supported TARP, and a number of other disastrous policies. Ladies and gentlemen, R.J. Harris, rjharris2012.com. I hope you'll check it out and support his candidacy to represent Oklahoma's 4th Congressional.
The news brought to you by